All right, so today we're tackling a question that I think has been on everyone's minds, especially when we talk about global politics.
Yeah.
Is the USA a force for good in the world, or are they mostly just looking out for themselves?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a question that has real implications, especially for our listeners who are preparing for the UPSC exams, particularly those focusing on international relations.
Yeah, this isn't just some abstract academic debate. This gets to the heart of how countries interact, how power plays out on a global scale.
Exactly.
And it's something that, impacts all of us no matter where we live. And, speaking of UPSC, the source material we've got for this deep dive, it's actually recommended reading for the international relations section. So this is definitely going to be relevant for those exams.
It is. And, it's interesting because the material we have, there are just some really strong opinions on both sides of this debate. You've got folks arguing that the U.S. is this benevolent hegemon, this force for good in the world. And then you've got others, like Noam Chomsky, who are very critical, arguing that the U.S. is primarily driven by self-interest and often acts in ways that are detrimental to others.
Yeah, when you look at history, it's hard to deny that the U.S. has played a significant role in shaping the global order, but was that role ultimately a positive one or a negative one, or maybe somewhere in between?
That's what we're going to try to unpack today. We're going to delve into those arguments, look at the evidence, and try to understand the different perspectives on this really complex issue.
All right, so let's start with this idea of the U.S. as a benevolent hegemon, this force for good.
Yeah.
Where does that idea even come from?
Well, one of the key theoretical frameworks that underpins that view is hegemonic stability theory. This theory argues that a single powerful state, a hegemon, can actually create stability in the international system.
Okay, so like a global police officer, keeping everyone in line.
Exactly. The idea is that the hegemon can provide public goods like security and economic stability that benefit everyone. They can enforce rules, prevent conflict, and promote cooperation.
So a world with the U.S. at the top is a world with more peace and prosperity. That's the argument, at least.
That's the argument. Now, of course, not everyone buys into this theory. Critics point out that even if a hegemon has good intentions, their actions can still have negative consequences, especially for those who are less powerful.
Right, because power can corrupt, and even the best intentions can go awry. But before we get into the critiques, let's give the benevolent hegemon view its due. What are some of the examples that supporters of this view point to?
Well, they often cite things like the U.S.'s role in rebuilding Europe and Japan after World War II through the Marshall Plan. They argue that this was a genuinely altruistic act that helped to create a more stable and prosperous world.
Yeah, and I can see how that would be a compelling argument, especially when you consider the devastation of Europe after the war. It's hard to imagine what the world would look like if the U.S. hadn't stepped in.
Right. They also point to the U.S.-led creation of institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which they argue have helped to promote global economic stability and development.
Okay, so there's definitely a case to be made that the U.S. has made some positive contributions to the world order. But then you have someone like Chomsky who comes along and says, hold on a minute, let's look at the other side of the coin.
Exactly. Chomsky's perspective, which he calls radical realism, is a lot more critical. He argues that powerful states, and the U.S. in particular, are inherently driven by self-interest, and that this self-interest often manifests in acts of aggression, exploitation, and even violence.
He doesn't mince words, does he?
Yeah.
He actually says in one of our sources, the United States has a remarkable record of supporting tyranny, brutality, and state terrorism throughout the world. That's a pretty damning indictment.
It is. And he backs it up with historical examples, like U.S. interventions in Vietnam, Latin America, the Middle East. He argues that the U.S. has consistently used its power to undermine democracy, prop up dictators, and secure access to resources, often at the expense of local populations.
That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, even those seemingly benevolent acts, like promoting democracy or free trade, are those always what they seem? Could they also be tools for advancing U.S. interests, even if it means harming others in the process?
That's the question Chomsky forces us to ask. He's not saying that the U.S. is inherently evil or that they never do anything good. His point is that we need to be critical, to look beyond the rhetoric and examine the actual consequences of U.S. actions.
I think that's a valuable perspective. Even if you don't agree with everything Chomsky says, it's important to challenge those assumptions, to dig deeper and question those narratives.
Absolutely. And that brings us to some of the most controversial U.S. actions in recent history, particularly those surrounding the so-called War on Terror and the invasion of Iraq.
These events really highlight the complexities of U.S. foreign policy and how difficult it can be to disentangle motives and consequences. And for our listeners preparing for the UPSC, understanding these events and the debates surrounding them is absolutely crucial.
You're right. The war on terror and the invasion of Iraq are lightning rods in this debate about U.S. hegemony.
So let's dive into those a little bit.
Okay.
What are the main arguments that critics of these actions make?
Well, critics argue that the invasion of Iraq, for example, was based on false pretenses, that the Bush administration exaggerated the threat posed by Saddam Hussein and used the war on terror as a pretext to pursue their own geopolitical goals in the region.
Like controlling Iraqi oil.
Exactly. And they point to the disastrous consequences of the invasion, the instability, the rise of sectarian violence, the emergence of groups like ISIS. They argue that this was a prime example of U.S. interventionism gone wrong, driven by self-interest and resulting in chaos and suffering.
Okay, so that's the critique. But what about those who defend these actions? What's their perspective?
Those who defend the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq, they'll often argue that while the execution may have been flawed, the intentions were noble. They'll say that the U.S. was genuinely trying to combat terrorism, to spread democracy, to make the world a safer place.
So good intentions, but bad outcomes.
Something like that. And they'll also point out that the world is a complex place and that there are no easy answers when it comes to foreign policy. They'll say that it's easy to criticize in hindsight, but that those in power have to make tough decisions based on imperfect information.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
But I think it's still important to hold those in power accountable for their decisions and to learn from those mistakes.
Absolutely. And that's why these debates are so important. By engaging with these different perspectives, by scrutinizing the evidence and challenging those assumptions, we can hopefully gain a deeper understanding of the U.S.'s role in the world and its impact on other countries, including our own.
I couldn't agree more. And this leads us to another big question that's been looming over this entire discussion. Is U.S. hegemony even sustainable in the long run? Is their global dominance fading?
That's a huge question, and honestly, there's no easy answer. Some experts argue that we're witnessing the decline of the American empire, while others say that reports of its demise have been greatly exaggerated.
So it's like we're at this crossroads, and there are these two very different paths that the future could take. And which path we end up on, that's going to have major consequences for everyone.
It really will. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at those potential scenarios, a world where the U.S. maintains its dominance, a world where China rises to the top, or maybe even a world where power is more evenly distributed.
So lots to unpack. Stick with us, folks, because things are about to get really interesting.
Welcome back to our deep dive into U.S. hegemony. Before we jumped into the potential futures, we were discussing the factors that point towards continued U.S. dominance. It's important to really understand these, especially for our UPSC aspirants who need to analyze global power dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't just write off the U.S. Like, they still have some serious advantages. Just look at their military capabilities. Nobody else even comes close in terms of military spending, and their global military presence is massive. It's a huge factor.
Right, and it's not just about the size of their military, it's also about the technology. The U.S. has always been at the forefront of military innovation, and that hasn't changed. They're still leading the way in areas like aerospace, biotechnology, AI, all these cutting-edge technologies that have military applications.
So it's like they're playing this high-stakes game of global chess, and they've got all the best pieces. But even with all that, some experts are saying that the U.S. is relying too much on brute force, on military power. And in today's world, where the threats are more complex, more like, like guerrilla warfare and terrorism, that kind of approach might not be as effective.
It's an interesting point. Think about the challenges the U.S. has faced in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. They had overwhelming military superiority, but they still struggled to achieve clear victories against insurgents and terrorist groups. It seems that raw military power on its own might not be enough to guarantee global dominance in the 21st century.
So if military might isn't the be-all and end-all, what else is there? What other factors are going to determine whether the U.S. can stay on top?
Well, the economy is obviously crucial. The U.S. still has the largest economy in the world, but China is catching up fast. And the U.S. has its own internal economic challenges, like rising inequality and, of course, the national debt, which seems to just keep growing.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people are starting to question the American dream, that idea that if you work hard, you can always get ahead. And if the U.S. is struggling internally, that's going to affect their ability to project power on the global stage.
Absolutely. A country that's divided and struggling at home is going to have a hard time leading effectively abroad. And then there's the whole question of soft power, that ability to influence others not through force, but through culture, values, diplomacy.
Yeah, the U.S. has traditionally been really good at that. Hollywood movies, American music, those ideals of freedom and democracy, all of that has contributed to America's global appeal. But I wonder, has that soft power been tarnished in recent years?
It's a valid question. Things like the war on terror,
Hmm.
the invasion of Iraq, the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, those events definitely damaged America's image in many parts of the world. It's made it harder for them to build alliances and influence global opinion.
So it's not just about tanks and bombs anymore. It's about the stories a country tells about itself and whether those stories resonate with people around the world. If the U.S. wants to stay on top, they're going to have to find new ways to project their values and influence.
Absolutely. The world is changing, and the old playbook might not work anymore. The U.S. can't just coast on past successes. They need to adapt, evolve if they want to keep playing a leading role in the 21st century. And that brings us to the other side of the coin, the arguments for U.S. decline.
Okay, let's dive into those. We know China's economic rise is a big factor, but what else points towards a decline in U.S. dominance?
Well, one argument is that the U.S. has overextended itself, both militarily and diplomatically. They've been involved in too many conflicts, spread their resources too thin. That's led to what some call imperial overstretch and a reluctance to get involved in new foreign policy adventures.
Yeah, and there's also this idea that the U.S. is becoming more isolationist, more focused on their own internal problems and less interested in being the world's policeman. And if the U.S. steps back, that could create a vacuum, and other powers like China or maybe even Russia could be ready to step in.
Exactly. And that shift in the balance of power would have huge implications for countries like India, who have traditionally relied on the U.S. for security and economic partnerships.
So we've got these two competing narratives. The U.S. is this resilient superpower that can weather any storm, and the U.S. as a declining power struggling to keep up in a changing world. So where do we go from here? What are the possible scenarios?
Well, that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the potential implications of continued U.S. dominance, the rise of China as a global leader, and the possibility of a multipolar world where no single country is calling all the shots.
This is where things get really interesting, especially for our UPSC aspirants who need to be thinking strategically about India's place in this shifting global order. So stick with us, folks, because we're about to unpack the future, and it's going to be a wild ride. Okay, so we've laid out the arguments, the history, the challenges. We've looked at the U.S. from both sides, right? The benevolent hegemon, the self-serving power, and we talked about whether their power is actually fading. So now, the big question. What happens next? What does the future hold, and what does it mean for India?
Right, we've got a few potential scenarios to unpack here, and each one has some pretty major implications, not just for international relations in general, but specifically for India's foreign policy. This is where all that UPSC prep starts to pay off.
All right, so let's play this out. Let's say the U.S. somehow they manage to hold on to their top spot. What does that world look like?
Well, in that scenario, we'd probably see a continuation of the current global order, with the U.S. at the helm of institutions like the UN, NATO, those big players. They'd likely keep pushing for free trade, democracy promotion, and a security structure that basically aligns with their interests.
So more of the same. But the question is that even realistic? I mean, we've talked about all the challenges they're facing both inside the U.S. and globally.
That's the big if. Can the U.S. adapt? Can they handle a world where power is becoming more spread out? Can they maintain their economic edge with China breathing down their neck? Can they, I don't know, rehab their image after some of those, let's say, questionable foreign policy moves?
There's a lot to overcome. Okay, so let's flip the script. Let's say the U.S. does decline and China takes over as the big dog, the global leader. That's a pretty massive shift.
Yeah.
What are we looking at then?
Well, a China-led world order, it would likely operate on a different set of values and systems. Think more state-controlled economy, regional alliances centered around Beijing, and a security setup that reflects their interests, especially in Asia.
And that changes everything, especially for India. We're right there on their border. We've got this whole history with them. How does India even navigate that kind of world, a world where China's calling the shots?
That's the million-dollar question for Indian policymakers, and honestly, there are no easy answers. Aligning too closely with the U.S., that could really tick off China, but staying neutral, well, that might not be an option if China becomes the dominant force in our backyard.
It's a tough spot. So U.S. dominance, Chinese dominance. Is there a third way? What about a world where power is more, I don't know, distributed?
That's the idea behind a multipolar world. No single superpower, but instead you have several major players, the US, China, the EU, India, maybe Russia, all competing for influence.
So kind of a free-for-all. Wouldn't that just be like total chaos?
It could be, but it could also be a huge opportunity, especially for a country like India. In a multipolar world, we're not forced to pick a side. We can play the field, leverage our relationships with different powers to our advantage.
So instead of being stuck on one team, India could chart its own course, play its own game, and try to shape the global order to fit its own interests.
Precisely. That's the potential upside. Of course, there are risks too. India would need to be really smart, really strategic in its diplomacy to navigate all those competing interests.
So no matter what happens, it's going to be a fascinating but also pretty challenging future for India on the global stage. What are some of the key takeaways, especially for our listeners prepping for those UPSC exams? What should they be thinking about?
Well, first off, understand the historical context. That post-World War II order with the U.S. running the show, that's ending. We're in a new era, a period of transition, and honestly, nobody knows for sure what's coming next.
Right, it's not just a simple handover from the U.S. to China. There are so many possibilities.
Exactly. So pay attention to the trends we've been talking about, those economic shifts, military developments, new technologies, the rise of new powers. Those are the forces shaping the future.
And most importantly, I think critically about India's role in all of this. Where do we fit in? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? And how do we use all of that to achieve our goals in a world that's changing so fast?
Those are the questions that are going to define India's success in the 21st century. And those are the questions that you, as future diplomats and policymakers, are going to be wrestling with throughout your careers.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into U.S. hegemony and the future of global power. We've covered a lot of ground, but as always, this is just the starting point.
Keep learning, keep questioning, keep exploring. The world of international relations is never static. The only way to stay ahead of the curve is to stay engaged.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive and want to keep exploring these big questions, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more. Until next time.